In this video lecture, we are going to discuss the topic of measures to be adopted in factories. As discussed earlier, the main purpose of codification of the factory legislation is to improve the working conditions in factories and to provide effective and proper measure for maintenance of health, safety and welfare of the workers. So in order to ensure that this object is achieved, the Act specifies certain measures which are to be mandatorily adopted in all factories. These measures are health, safety, welfare measures, working hours of adults, measures related to employment of young persons, related to annual leave and wages, and some miscellaneous matters. Now, earlier the factories legislations that were there prior to 1948 had very minimal health, safety, and welfare measures, and they were all clubbed under one chapter. However, with the enactment of the 1948 legislation, health, safety, and welfare, which is the primary goal of this legislation, are three independent chapters, and all these measures are given in detail in the legislation, where it deals with very uh, detailed specifications that are to be adopted and followed by the owner or occupier of the factory in order to provide the workmen with adequate health, safety, and welfare measures. Unless the workers are physically and mentally healthy, they cannot perform their work effectively and properly. So, in the interest of the employer, also, it is necessary that these measures are strictly adopted, violation of which will be held, which will be penalized under the legislation. So, we'll go with each of these measures one by one. The first is health measures. There are 10 health measures that are specified in the Act. The health measures here are in the legislation are given in a lot of detail with very detailed specifications in terms of minimum requirements, size, space, everything. So if you want, you can go through the bare act of the legislation and see in detail what kind of measures that they talk about. For purposes of this lecture and for your understanding, I'll only give out the important points and references under each of the health measures and other subsequent measures. So, health measures are cleanliness, disposal of wastes and effluents, ventilation and temperature, dust and fumes, and artificial humidification. Now, cleanliness is one of the most important health measures that the Act deals with. Naturally, every factory has a lot of workmen and there is a lot of scope for unhygienic conditions that may happen in a factory. So, in order to prevent uh, in order to protect the workers from insanitary conditions, the Act specifies that cleanliness, the factory must be clean, kept clean and free from all kinds of dirt and refuse. And in order to implement this, what are the different effective methods that need to be adopted is also specified. For example, that the floor of every workroom must be cleaned daily and at least once a week. They should use antiseptic material to wash the floor. If the floor is liable to be wet during manufacturing process, then proper drainage method should be adopted. There should be proper drainage facilities. The walls, partitions, ceilings, staircases, passages, all these should be periodically painted. There should be whitewashing of walls, and all of this has to be complied with at regular intervals. What is the interval at which the factory walls have to be painted, the where they when they have to be whitewashed? All of that is specified in the Act itself. Second health measure is disposal of wastes and effluents. Naturally, every factory has wastes and effluents which are generated through their manufacturing process, and it is important that these wastes and effluents are disposed of effectively. They undergo treatment and then are effectively disposed of, not only to protect the workers who are engaged there, but also in general to prevent pollution of the environment. So the Act talks about effective arrangements that need to be made for treatment of wastes and effluents due to the manufacturing process, and that it is mandatory for the occupier to comply with these effective arrangements and to comply with these provisions. Third, ventilation and temperature. In factories, generally the environment remains full of dust and fume, and there runs excessive temperature, which affects the health of the workers who are engaged in that factory. So, in order to protect them from high temperature and from improper ventilation, it is specified that at all times the factory, the owner or occupier must ensure that there is proper ventilation. There should be facilities made for proper ventilation for fresh air, and effective methods must be adopted to maintain reasonable temperature and as low temperature as practicable inside the factory, so that the workers work in a comfortable environment, depending on depending on which kind of factory they are employed in. Say for example, if the workers are working in a manufacturing process where the production itself leads to excessive high temperature, then the factory must have adequate measures such as insulating the hot parts of the workplace, of the room, so that the workers can be separated from the high temperature that is produced in these workrooms. So the walls, the roofs, all of it must be designed in such a manner that the temperature is as low as possible. What kind of material should be used, what should be the height of the ceiling, what kind of paint should be used, all of that is specified in the Act itself. Fourth, dust and fumes. Like wastes and effluents, every factory, along with high temperature, also has a lot of dusts and fumes that are generated, and accumulation or inhalation of these dusts and fumes may lead to a lot of uh, health issues among the workers. So, in order to avoid dust and fume and other impurities from being accumulated, it is important that necessary steps in the form of, say, exhaust appliances and other measures should be adopted and installed in the factories to protect the workers. Fifth, artificial humidification. The Act specifies that if in a factory humidity of the air is to be artificially increased for purposes of the manufacturing process, then the water which is used for such artificial humidification has to mandatorily be taken from a public supply or source of drinking water, or it has to be effectively purified before it is used. The reason being that once it is artificially humidified, once the air is artificially humidified, the workers are going to inhale that air and work in that atmosphere. So the source of the water for this purpose, for this artificial humidification, is very important in order to protect them from any kind of health hazards. Further, the state government also has been given wide powers in order to prescribe the standard of humidification, regulate the methods for such artificial humidification. They can also direct or prescribe tests for determining the humidity of the air, and other necessary measures which can necessary to be adopted in order to secure adequate ventilation and cooling of the air. All of that is can be specified by the state government, and the owner or occupier has to mandatorily abide by it. The next five health measures provided in the Act are overcrowding, lighting, drinking water, latrines and urinals, and spittoons. Now, overcrowding there isn't a better time than now to understand what are the side effects or ill effects of overcrowding. Likewise, in a factory, also overcrowding of workers inside a particular workroom may prove to be dangerous for the workers. So, the Act specifies that in no workroom of the factory shall workers be overcrowded to an extent that it becomes injurious to their health. Likewise, it specifies what should be the space provided for every worker who is employed in a particular workroom. How much of floor space, how much of space can be occupied by one worker is already mentioned in the legislation, and it has to be complied with. So, accordingly, it can be calculated what are the maximum number of persons that can be allowed inside a particular workroom. So, at no point should overcrowding in one particular workroom happen or take place. Seventh is lighting. So, naturally, to avoid strain to the eyes of the workers, every workroom has to be adequately, sufficiently lighted. They, as far as possible, there should be no glare or reflection from polished surfaces, which can increase the risk of accidents. The state government has the power to prescribe standards of sufficient and suitable lighting for factories. What should be done to prevent formation of shadows, which can cause eye strain to the workers, which can increase risk of accidents? All of that is specified in the factories in the Factories Act. So it emphasizes that lighting arrangement, both natural as well as artificial type, is required in the factory, and where natural light becomes insufficient, artificial lighting has to be arranged. The main idea behind this is to prevent the risk of accidents. Eighth health measure is drinking water. That every factory must have a source of clean drinking water at convenient places, which is accessible by all workers. It should be situated in a place uh, such as where the workers can easily access it, and that all these points of drinking water have to be suitably labeled as drinking water in a language which is understood by majority of the workers. So depending on where the factory is located, accordingly, in that language of that region, particular region, it has to be specified. If the factory has more than 250 workers, then cool drinking water provision also has to be provided for hot weathers. The ninth health measure is latrines and urinals. Along with drinking water facilities, there should be proper arrangement for latrines and urinals to be used by the workers. The state government has the power to prescribe the number of latrines and urinals that are to be provided in any factory in proportion to the number of male and female workers who are ordinarily employed in that factory. Um, Furthermore, in factories where more than 250 workers are employed, uh, what is the prescribed sanitary type of all latrines and urinal is to be is provided in the legislation. What is the height of the walls? What should be the space of or each of the latrines and urinal blocks? All of it is mentioned in the legislation itself, which has to be complied with. And the last one is spittoons. In order to ensure cleanliness and sanitary conditions and to avoid dirty and insanitary atmosphere in the factory, sufficient number of spittoons are to be provided at convenient places for the use of the workers, and they have to be maintained in clean and hygienic conditions as well. And the workers are not permitted to spit anywhere within the factory premises except in these designated spittoons. So these are the 10 health measures that are provided in the legislation. Now we move on to the safety measures. The safety measures, safety being one of the basic and primary requirement in a factory, the safety measures cover a lot of um, details with respect to machines, machinery, and working around these machines and machinery. So if you go through the provision in the Bare Act of safety measures of the chapter of safety measures, you will find that it ranges from a lot of different kinds of safety measures that are to be adopted in a factory. We'll not go into the details of each of these safety measures because it is not uh, relevant for purposes of your examination or for uh, in order to understand, because it's very technical in nature. But if you want, you can go through these safety measures in detail. For purposes of this lecture, I have only listed down on your screen what are the different kind of safety measures that are mentioned in the legislation. So they range from fencing of machinery to striking gear and devices for cutting of power, to casing of new machinery, prohibition of employment of women and children near cotton openers. Then you have provisions with respect to pressure plant, with respect to floors, stairs, and means of access, excessive weights, what kind of measures have to be adopted for protection of eyes of the workers, what kind of precautions are required to protect the workers from dangerous fumes. Thereafter, you have safety measures with regard to explosives, inflammable dust, gas, etc. What precautions are necessary in cases of fire, emergencies, what safety measures for buildings and machineries need to be adopted, how the buildings have to be maintained, that safety officers also need to be appointed inside the factory in order to ensure that all of these safety measures are complied with, are maintained regularly, and in order to check when and where need for better safety provision is necessary. All these cover your safety measures. Please go through the Bare Act if you want to, in order to see the details of these measures. The remaining measures that are adopted in the factories will be dealt with in the next video lecture. If you have any doubts with respect to this lecture, please note them down and post them in the discussion Q&A forum created on the website.